All right, it's 6:32, so let's get started. My name is Sarah Anderson, and I am the director for the Disarmament and International Security Committee, or DISEC, at H1 India 2016. I also serve as the Undersecretary General for the General Assembly at HNMUN 2017, which is our college conference in Boston. In the past, I've directed DISEC at HMUN China 2016 and HNMUN 2016, and I've also competed in a couple GAs and ECOSOCs around the college circuit in the United States. I've been involved in Model UN for a very long time, since the 8th grade, and even though I've tried out a lot of different activities within Model UN, from conference planning to GA ECOSOC crisis, the GA definitely remains my favorite organ. So today's seminar, which is Tips for Success in the General Assembly, will hopefully give you a couple ideas as to how you can really excel and succeed in the GA. Just to be not redundant, I'm not going to talk too much about the basics, things like rules of procedure, how to give a good speech, how to do well in blocks, simply because these are going to be covered in past or future webinars. And if you want to know more about those, you can check out hmunindia.org under the preparations page. There's a whole schedule of webinars that are going to be provided to you. All right, so let's get started a bit and just talk about what the GA is in case you don't know. So in the real world, the General Assembly is kind of the heart of the United Nations. It's where most decisions are made, and it's where all member states of the United Nations come together to discuss, debate, and finally resolve very important global issues. These issues tend to be more broad in nature. So for example, you might not be talking about the domestic situation of one specific country, but you might be talking about things like women's and maternal health, or the future of state boundaries in the Middle East, which is my topic for DISEC this year, and things that generally affect the welfare, security, and well-being of all the world's citizens. The General Assembly is very unique in that, once again, all countries are member states and they're all equally represented. It's one nation, one vote, unlike other bodies like the Security Council in the United States, in the United Nations, which only has 15 members and in which 5 countries have veto power, so there's not quite equal there. Some other important things to note about the GA, which is true to both the Model UN GA and the real world GA, is that resolutions, which are the documents that you produce at the end of GA debate, aren't binding. So even if a country signs on to it, they don't necessarily have to do the things in the resolution. Usually, if a country signs on to it, is a sponsor or a signatory, they generally tend to agree with it, and therefore they'll carry it out. It's kind of an unspoken rule that they would like to follow the resolution. But just important to note that you can't force a country to do something with a General Assembly resolution, although usually it's a very good idea to follow the will of the majority of the world's countries. Something else to note is that it is different from the UN Security Council in that its resolutions aren't binding and that it can't really affect international security in a very direct manner. So for example, DISEC, the Disarmament and International Security Committee, can talk about long-term frameworks and structures and protocols for security, but it's only the Security Council that can deal with a specific conflict, like maybe defeating ISIS. So those are just a couple things to keep in mind about the GA, and as we go along, feel free to ask questions of me in the chat box, and I'd love to respond to them either as we go along or at the end, if anything comes up. All right, so just for those of you who are just joining in, this webinar is going to cover tips and tricks to the GA, and I won't be repeating things about the basics like ROP, speeches, and things like that. And if you are behind, if you have any questions, just let me know. All right. So what will the GA look like at HMUN India? You may have attended conferences around the South Asian circuit, for example, that are slightly different from HMUN India because we do follow American procedure, and even within that, HMUN has a couple of special rules. So in general, when you walk into the GA room at HMUN India, there's going to be about 200 delegates, maybe fewer, and they're all single del. So that means that one country has one delegate representing it. You may have been in conferences conferences where there's one country and two delegates representing it. This conference, we only have one single del representing each country. There's going to be a director, so I'm one of the directors, one of the Harvard students that's volunteered to come to H1 India and run a committee, and also 3 to 4 assistant directors that will be helping the main director throughout the conference. As a general rule of thumb, if you have any substantive questions relating to the topic, you should direct it to the director, but if you have any questions about procedure, about the schedule, or maybe some more common knowledge questions about Model UN procedure, you can ask the assistant directors as well. It might depend on the committee. In real life, there are 6 committees in the GA, and there's going to be 3 at HMIT India out of these 6. DISEC, the Disarmament and International Security Committee, SPECPOL, the Special Political and Decolonization Committee, and SOCUM, the Social, Humanitarian, and Cultural Committee. The 4th committee at the General Assembly in HMIT India is HGA, or the Historical General Assembly, and this is kind of a special, unique committee that mainly only H1 does, and it's going to be a very exciting experience. The HGA isn't necessarily specific to a single topic area, but instead will cover the happenings of the world during that time period. And also, please note that the GA at H1 India, as I said before, has a slightly different mandate from the crisis and ECOSOC committees. So everything, all the solutions, all the issues discussed need to pertain to all of the countries in the world, need to have an equitable view of the international community, and might not want to target very, very specific areas, very specific issues, simply because there's a lot of more broad topics that can be addressed in the general umbrella of your topic area in your committee. All right, now why the GA? Why do I think it's great? Why should you think it's great? And why do we really highlight it at H1 India? First of all, as I've repeatedly mentioned, it has universal representation, which means that every country from the United States to Zimbabwe to St. Vincent and the Grenadines has the exact same amount of voice in committee. Now, some people might disagree with me in saying that, well, what if we're talking about the future of state boundaries in the Middle East and you're representing Syria? You're obviously much more important to this topic than, say, Seychelles is. And yes, I won't deny that that might be true, and that's probably the same with many topics, but that doesn't mean that you as a delegate can't make an impact. Simply do your research and find out how your country pertains to the issue, what you can offer, and what new ideas you can offer as an individual to help really put you forward in the committee. The GA is also great because it has a very wide scope of topics, as I mentioned. So DISEC, SOCUM, SPECPOL all address very different things and can also approach the same topic from different angles, whether it's humanitarian, cultural, security, political, things like that. And then lastly, the GA is very, very unique in that it's a unique format for collaboration. Because you're working with 200 delegates, it's very, very different from a crisis situation in which you get to know all 15 delegates in your committee. So usually in the GA, people form blocks, which means that you have smaller groups within the committee of like-minded delegates in like-minded countries that work together on working papers and draft resolutions to solve the issue. So one block might have a very different ideology from another block, but at the end of the day, you need to try and reach compromise between these blocks and have heated debate in order to pass one draft resolution into a resolution at the end of the conference. All right, I'm just looking through your questions, and I think I will get to them at the end. Great. So how do you GA? When you walk into the GA room and the chair bangs the gavel, what happens? Once again, there's going to be, I think, 2 webinars on rules of procedure, so I won't go into the nitty-gritty, but in general, here's what to expect. When you walk into the GA room, what you do is you sit down at a chair, you look around you, you probably get overwhelmed because there's so many fantastic people and delegates sitting around you, and I would say that the first thing you should do is make friends, for 2 reasons. First of all, it's a very unique opportunity to come together with fellow youths from around South Asia and actually from around the world. And it would be a great opportunity to hear their backgrounds, their stories, their ideas, just in a personal context. I've made a lot of friends at conferences that I still talk to, and so it's a very unique experience. But secondly, the more strategic reason as to why you should make friends is because they might become very helpful to you later in the conference. Whether they join your block, or you can talk to them about what ideas they have and then combine them with yours, Or they might be in another block, and you can find out what that block is doing, maybe some opportunities for merging and compromise, etc., etc. So don't try to target the big countries right away when you're making friends. Simply look around you, see who's interesting, see who might have some of the same or very different ideas from your country, and make sure you take down their number or get their name and just generally try to be friendly with everybody. So the next thing is debate will finally start. The director will bang his or her gavel, take roll call, and the first thing you do in a general assembly is open debate. And that's a rule procedure kind of thing. In general, during the first day, you won't get too much debate in. You might have a speakers list, which means that people just sign up to speak and then will speak and we'll just keep on going along the speakers list. A very important thing to note that I would like to drill in your heads right now is that there are no points of information at H1 procedure, which means that you can't ask questions of the speaker. So for example, a speakers list, it might be very frustrating because a delegate's just made a point that you heavily disagree with, or they might even be factually incorrect. But unfortunately, according to rules of procedure, you simply just go on to the next speech in the speakers list. Then, further along the first day, you might have some moderated caucuses in which the director will take speakers, maybe 3 or 4 at a time. You'll come up and speak, and this is different from the speakers list in 2 main ways. First, you can control the topic. So when you make motions for the moderated caucus, you can say, motion for moderated caucus, 15 minutes, 1 minute speaking time about topic X. So it's far more specific than the speakers list. And then the second thing is, because the director is calling on a couple people at a time instead of taking a lot of names at once, the speakers will usually actually respond to one another. So the moderated caucus is the main forum for debate in the General Assembly. Usually not much else happens on the first day. You just get in some introductory debate, you get to see what people are thinking, what they would like to focus on, and you may or may not have an opportunity for an unmoderated caucus. And that's kind of the heart of the GA, the informal debate where you will get your work done. So in an unmoderated caucus, what can happen is that delegates can freely talk amongst themselves, leave the room for about 10 to 15 minutes, and finally get some work done. Usually during this first unmoderated caucus, I don't think anything will be produced, hopefully, but you simply might start to form blocks, start to make friends, and see where people are gravitating in terms of the ideological and political spectrum of your topic. So when all of that is done on the debate, whether it's formal or informal on the first day, you'll end the first session, and I would strongly advise, if you'd like to have a successful experience in the GA, to take people's numbers down. A lot of work, surprisingly enough, is done that night and the next morning before the second session. And when I say work, I mean starting to write working papers. So if you'd like to really be ahead of the committee and make sure that you're not falling behind, and if you want to make sure that your ideas are at the forefront of debate, make sure that you're writing your working paper during that time between the first and second sessions. I say take people's numbers down because it's very helpful to say, all right, guys, let's meet at 9 a.m. in the hotel lobby and we're going to work together on our working papers. But some people won't show up, some people might oversleep, so it's just very helpful to have a medium of communication for everyone to follow throughout the conference. All right, so day 2. Day 2 is a long day, and it's mostly full of working paper debate. So day 1 is introductory debate, day 2 is working paper debate. Working papers, in case you don't already know, are kind of preliminary documents that give a sense of what the committee is thinking about the topic. They don't have to follow any format at all according to H1 procedure. You could simply have like a bunch of pictures on a document and that would be perfectly fine. Usually people prefer to put their working papers in draft resolution format so that during the merging stage and then during the draft resolution writing stage, it's much easier and much more transferable. And that's just a tip that I would probably advise. You can find draft working papers, sample working papers and sample draft resolutions in the delegate handbook. So all of second session and most of third session, you'll be talking about working papers, talking about more specific and nuanced aspects of the topic in moderated caucuses. And in unmoderated caucuses, you can take time to write these working papers to kind of pull delegates into your block and say, all right, this is our idea, want to work with us, want to contribute any ideas. And then usually there's also going to be opportunities for mergers after working papers are introduced, which is usually during the third session. And during that time, you will want to work with other blocks and other working papers to see, all right, what ideas are compatible and we can put them together in one big draft resolution, and what ideas aren't so compatible that we have to work out. Um, and then this detailed merging process usually happens that night of the second day, and then maybe the morning of the third day, you'll be writing the draft resolution and really finalizing it. Then lastly, on the third day, you'll be finalizing your draft resolutions. They'll be introduced, and you'll have some more general debate on the topic, but most of it is going to center around the draft resolutions. How are they good? How are they similar? How are they different? Which one should the committee pass? And just general things like that. If you're not already familiar, very, very quick rundown. When the draft resolutions are introduced, this varies very, very heavily from chair to chair, so make sure that you talk to your chair in advance or listen to them. But the way I usually like to do it is I'll give out the draft resolutions to the entire committee, have about 15 minutes of silent reading time so that you can take notes about points that you'd like to discuss in each draft resolution. Then all of the sponsors of each draft resolution will come up, or usually a set amount, and talk a little bit about the draft resolution and then take questions. And after that period, there's going to be a long time of moderated caucus to discuss the draft resolutions. There's going to be amendment procedure, which usually spills over into the fourth day, the final day, and then finally they're voted upon, and only one can pass. So I've just given you a very, very fast and furious run through of what a General Assembly conference might look like, and I'll go through your questions and see if there's any that pertain to the procedure. All right. So one person asked, is there a limitation for the number of delegates in each block? No, there is not. A block can be as big as you want. It can be I've been in a two-person block before in an ECOSOC committee. We just wrote a resolution together and it was fantastic. But usually blocks will be about like 20, 30 people. But in general, no, there's no official limitation. It is important to note that usually when it's time to introduce draft resolutions and the sponsors of each draft resolution go up and present the resolution, there is a limited amount of people who you can do that. So there's no limit to the amount of people who can work on a DR, but there is a limit to the amount that can present, and that limit is at the discretion of the chair. One more thing that I forgot to mention, H1 is very strange in that we do not have signatories to working papers or draft resolutions. We only have sponsors, and we don't have a main sponsor and secondary sponsors, it's just sponsors. To be quite honest, the chair won't notice what order you put the sponsors in, who is on the sponsors list, so don't really worry about it. Just know that if you worked on a document, you should be on the sponsors list. All right. Let's see. Are we allowed to use electronics during the session? That's a very good question because it's kind of complicated. When you're in the committee room and debate is going on, you cannot use electronics, whether it's an electronic dictionary, your phone, your computer, things like that. So the two times that you can use electronics are A, when debate is not going on and not in session, whether it's between committee sessions, at the end of the day, at the beginning of the day, etc. And the other time is during unmoderated caucuses. So that means that when the chair says, let's break for 15-minute unmoderated caucuses, you can just whip out your laptop and start writing in the committee room. And then the third kind of time that is less known about is during debate, you can actually leave the room to use your electronics. And I would strongly, strongly advise that you talk to your chair about this or just be very, very clear about this rule. But in general, if moderated caucuses are going on and you'd rather be writing your draft resolution or working paper instead of listening to the speeches, you can step out of the room, usually with some people in your block, and start writing. This is very, very important because usually there isn't enough time between the sessions to work completely on draft resolutions, for example, to get them to their tip-top shape, and also because new points might be introduced in debate, so you continuously have to update your draft resolutions. So this rule gives you an opportunity to do so. In general, you should note that you shouldn't stay out of the room for too long time, nor can too many people stay out of the room for too long time, and when it's time to vote, you have to be in the room. But that's just a small loophole in the rules that will allow you to take advantage of your electronics and writing time. How many sponsors? This will vary from chair to chair. Some will limit them, some will not. So you just have to ask your chair at the beginning of the conference or when it's time to write draft resolutions. Okay, I think that's all the questions that I have relating to procedure, and the rest I'll answer later because they're quite substantive. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the objectives in a GA committee. So what should your personal objectives be? What should the committee objectives be? And kind of what should your objectives be if you want to be successful in the GA? So let's start off with the committee objectives. The first number one committee objective should be to pass a good draft resolution. As I've said before, you can only pass one. So during voting procedure, the first one that is passed will be the official resolution for the committee. You can also not pass a draft resolution, which has happened many times, but that's quite sad because that means that your committee is too split and you haven't had enough diplomacy and compromise in order to properly solve the issue. So once again, your objective should be to pass a good draft resolution. Um, the other second objective of the committee should be having productive debate. So whether or not you pass a resolution, people will always think about what was said during the committee, what points are thrown out there, what kind of stances people are taking, and this in itself is a very, very important form of diplomacy and problem solving. So whenever you're sitting in the committee room, make sure that you're contributing good ideas, good points that are constructive to what the committee is doing. And lastly, a very, very important objective of the committee should be diplomacy. So always making sure that people are happy, that people are negotiating, that people are having heated debate, but at the same time really respecting one another, sticking to their country's policies, and just generally being good delegates and good diplomats. And I'll talk a bit more about this later. So as a delegate, what should your objectives be? I have two categories of objectives for you: baseline objectives that everyone should have, and then objectives for success if you really, really want to do very well in a General Assembly. So for the baseline objectives, first of all, have fun. You're there for 4 days, and there's no point sitting at the back of the room kind of being a loaf and just falling asleep the entire time when you could be making the most out of it. Secondly, make friends. As I said before, it's always a great part of Model UN to make like-minded people from around the world and to make friends. Third, build your knowledge of the topic. I can't tell you how much of my knowledge is from Model UN. It's almost kind of sad, but I've learned a lot more about the world, about current events, about how to solve problems through Model UN, through what other delegates are saying, and through the research process. Fourth of all, break your comfort zone and build your skills. I think that there are a lot of delegates out there that are very shy, that might have stage fright, and that don't have enough experience with public speaking. I would highly encourage delegates, if that's you, to really break your comfort zone. No one's going to think badly of you if you pause for a little bit during a speech or if you make a 15-second speech. It just matters what you say and if you're confident in yourself. So this is a fantastic opportunity to build those skills along with others. And then the last objective, which I think is the most important out of all of these, is to make sure that others around you are enjoying the experience. So if you're bullying people, if you're heckling people, if you're shutting them down when you're working with them, they will not have a fun modeling experience even if you feel like you are. It's much more important that the entire team and the entire committee has a good experience, that you might get more, like 2 more clauses into your draft resolution. Just always keep in mind that you need to be respectful and kind towards other delegates. So moving on, what should your objectives for success be? First of all, you have to represent your country well and accurately. So that means that you're a diplomat. So for example, I'm from Singapore originally, so if I was the delegate of Singapore, I would have to make sure that I'm being respectful, I'm speaking well, that I'm a good ambassador for Singapore, but that also I'm following our country's positions. So for example, Singapore would never come up to DISEC and say, all right, let's bomb Malaysia. We'd probably be like, let's take a diplomatic approach to solving the conflict in the Middle East, and an important ally would be Malaysia, blah, 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 blah. So make sure that you research your country's specific stance on your topic beforehand so that you're representing them well. More nuanced versions of this might be to know who your country's allies and enemies are ahead of time. So for example, South Korea would probably not work with North Korea on a resolution unless there's a very, very good reason, whereas the US and Israel might work together. In fact, it's very, very likely that they would. So the second objective for success is playing a leading role in a block. Obviously, only so many blocks in a committee can be formed, so it will be very competitive, but not to worry, there's always different roles that you can play. You don't necessarily have to be the one who's always standing up at the front of the room yelling at a crowd of delegates. In fact, directors might not look too kindly upon that. You should aim to be the one who's contributing the most ideas, maybe the framework of your draft resolution, maybe pulling other delegates in to collaborate, and maybe talking to other blocks to make sure that all voices in the committee are being heard. So just keep in mind that there are many variations on leadership that you can take a part in order to be successful. A third objective for success is playing a leading role in writing a document, which I would argue is different from leading a block. Leading a block can simply mean, all right, delegates, all 40 of you, yes, let's come out to the room. Let's come out of the room to this corner to talk, and then you talk to them. You're not really talking about much. I look personally more favorably upon the delegates who are always on their laptops, talking to other delegates, writing ideas down, perfecting the draft resolution, and focusing on the objective of the committee, which is putting out a good draft resolution, instead of their personal objective of being the loudest and the smartest sounding. Trust me, our directors have a lot of experience in Model UN, and they can very, very, very well tell these types of delegates apart. Two more objectives of success. The first is making good speeches. In a GA, there's so many delegates that you only have a couple opportunities to speak in front of the entire committee and in front of the director. So just make sure that you're really making the most of that minute or so, whether it's speaking well and articulately, and there is a webinar about this, or making very good points that are different from what's already been said. If you simply get up there and say, I, the delegate of Azerbaijan, agree with everything that's already been said, and I look forward to more fruitful debate, while people appreciate that, it's not really going to get you too many places in the committee in terms of success. And then lastly is visibility. You should have the objective of being very visible in your committee, and I'll talk about what that means later, but just in case you're taking notes, that's something very, very important to note. All right. So let's look at your questions before I move on to the meat of this webinar, which is my general tips and tricks for success in the GA. And I'm talking a lot. I'm sorry. Okay, so if you have any questions, make sure to put them in here. I'm so glad you guys are talking to each other. This is great. All right. Quickly, do we have crisis in DISEC? No. You might have crisis breaks in some committees in which your director will say, like, all right, we have an announcement from the IAEA that suddenly a nuclear reactor has blown up, something like that. And this can happen in the GA. It's just a general news update to the committee. I personally don't think this will happen in DISEC for you DISEC delegates out there. But in the GA, if that happens, you don't write crisis notes, you don't write a communique. It's simply a thing to factor into your working papers and draft resolutions. Will every delegate get a chance to speak? Yes. Some moderators and directors are very, very strict about this. I had a moderator that would not let anyone speak until every single delegate in the room had a chance to speak. Usually we won't be too strict about this, but we're very good about keeping track. So if a delegate has spoken 4 times versus a delegate that has spoken 0 times, the second delegate will be called upon. So you might not get a chance to speak that often, but you definitely will speak. And if you feel like you're being unfairly ignored by the chair and that they're not calling on you enough, you can just write a polite note to them saying, hello, please look on this side of the room and calling on people, or hello, I haven't been called on in this committee session and I really have something to say. Are national policies to be strictly followed when forming blocks? It frankly depends. I would say that because the GA is so big, the director will not be paying attention to every single word and every single sponsor that you're working with. So if it's a very small, nuanced issue, I wouldn't worry too much about it. But if it's something big like North Korea working with South Korea, or maybe Syria advocating extreme international intervention into Syria to solve the ISIS issue, then that would obviously be very problematic. I have a lot of questions about what if your country doesn't have a say in a given topic, whether that be in debate or a position paper. And this is quite a difficult issue, so I'll just talk about this now, and if you have any further questions, let me know. So I'll keep talking about DISEC because I'm noticing that a lot of you are in DISEC, and I'm just using this as an example. So if you're in HGA, SpecPol, or SOCUM, just know that all of this carries over. So my topic is the future of state boundaries in the Middle East, and obviously that has to do with the Middle East and the Middle East alone. All of the debate will probably focus around the Middle Eastern countries. So if you're not a Middle Eastern country, or you're not a country that has intervened or has wanted to intervene, then you might be wondering, why are we debating this? What would I even have to say? And yes, I'm not going to be, I'm not going to lie to you. It will be a harder time for you, and that you have to do more research. It's not going to be on the front pages and the headlines. Seychelles has done this to help the situation in the Middle East. You simply have to extrapolate. So, for example, if your country in the past has given humanitarian or military aid to similar conflicts, you might say, all right, I think we do the same thing in the Middle East. Other tips as to how you can go about deciding your country's policies include researching general organizations that your country might be a member of. So, for example, if you're a Senegal, you're a member of the African Union, so you can look for African Union's position on the Middle Eastern crisis. You can also do this for countries you know you're allies with. So, if you're Israel and you don't know your position, but you know the US's position, they're probably the same. Other things that you can think about are common sense. So, for example, if your topic deals with an issue that might divide small countries and big countries in terms of the impact, if you're a small country, then you need to think about how that issue impacts small countries and not big countries. There's some obvious delineations like that. They also might be by region, by economic prosperity, etc. And then when you're actually in the committee, don't feel the need to constantly say like, I'm from my country and we're related to this topic in X way, and that's why we believe X. In fact, this kind of gives you more creative liberty to think of your own ideas, to almost, I don't want to say make up a stance, but to kind of go off with what you have, and develop a very interesting position on the topic that might be even more creative and different from what someone who is very bound by an existing stance is, if that makes sense. So, for example, the delegate of the US might already have a very, very set position that they can't stray from on the Middle East, whereas a delegate from sub Saharan Africa might have more creative liberty on their stance. And lastly, I'm sorry, I'm ranting about this, but you can also think about how the topic might indirectly affect you or affect you many, many years down the line. So stemming terrorism in the Middle East might help countries, for example, in Northern Africa or in Southeast Asia, where the conflict is kind of spilling over to, if that makes any sense. All right, a couple more questions, if there are any. Questions on visibility, I'm going to talk about that in 1 second. Chit passing, we call it note passing. Yes, it's allowed, just not during voting procedure, and just only about topics relevant to debate. So you can't be like, hello, delegate of South Africa, what do you want for lunch? All right, a question about point of orders. I'm not sure what this question is exactly asking, but in general, a point of order can be made when the chair has done something incorrectly. So, for example, if they overlook a speaker, you can say, "Point of order, chair. I believe that the delegate of Zimbabwe was supposed to speak in this moderated caucus." And usually, the director will say, "All right, apologies. The delegate of Zimbabwe is recognized." So that's only when the chair has made a mistake. That's slightly different from a point of parliamentary inquiry, when you simply have a question about procedure and about what's going to happen next in the committee. You might want to elaborate on the types of point of order because I only am familiar with one. A question, how frequently will we get into an unmoderated caucus? It depends on the day. So, for example, on the first day, you might have 0 or 1 unmoderated caucuses, whereas when it's getting close to the time where you have to submit your draft resolution, there might be more to give you more time to work on it. For example, some chairs, including myself, might want to focus on debate on the topic itself and not have any unmoderated caucuses, whereas other chairs might want to really drill down getting those documents done so that we can move on in the committee. So it's simply up to the discretion of the chair. And if you feel like you need one, feel free to motion for one. If the chair strikes it down, then you can write a note giving a reason why. And keep in mind that you can always leave the room with your laptop during debate if you want to get extra time in on your working paper or draft resolution. How do you prevent point of orders? That's just a matter of the chair. So if the chair doesn't make any mistakes in procedure, then there should be no points of order. In general, as a delegate, I would say that maybe stray away from points of order unless it's something very serious, like the chair skipping over a speaker, because H1 procedure tends to be slightly different from salutation procedure. And also all procedures at the chair's discretion, so they might simply be following their own rules. Okay, can you ask a logical inaccuracy? Okay, so Anonymous 783136321 asked, can we ask a point of order about a logical inaccuracy and a factual inaccuracy? You can ask points about any of these. So for example, if a speaker makes a logical inaccuracy or a factual inaccuracy, you can't correct them, unfortunately, unless you're giving a speech and you can say, all right, the delegate of Great Britain made this error in a previous speech, but you can't stop debate with a point of order or point of information to say that, and that's simply H1 protocol. All right. I think I've answered all the questions so far, so if you have new ones, please let me know. And at this time, I'm going to be moving on to the last segment of this webinar, which is my tips for success into the GA. Before I start talking about tips for success, please note that these are simply mine from my experience and based on my own sharing philosophy. So if you're from DISEC, you can usually take these as what you should do, but if you're in another committee, your director might have a very different philosophy on chairing, awards, what a good delegate looks like, and I'll talk a bit about how to figure that out with your director a bit later. All right. So once again, just these are not these are simply suggestions. So my first tip, as I mentioned before, is visibility. What does this mean? In a room of 200 delegates, unfortunately, your director is not superhuman. We can't memorize every single name and face in every speech you've given. We're very, very serious about taking notes. Both the director and assistant director will be tallying how many speeches you've made, what you're a sponsor of, and maybe some notes about what you say or how you're performing in unmoderated caucuses and things like that. So always know that the dais is watching. Unfortunately, we can't watch every single second of what you're doing, and so every second that the chair is watching you counts. The most obvious form of this is when you're giving speeches. Make sure that they're good, because that's the one time that you are at the podium, that you're very, very visible to the dais and the entire committee, and that's your time to make an impact. But because there aren't that many chances to speak in a GA, people might ask, all right, like I only have 3 speeches and we're not allowed to ask questions and make points of information. So what am I to do to be more visible? Here's a couple tips. The first one is making your ideas heard. So when you're giving a speech, it is important to respond to other delegates, and it is important to maybe make more general statements, but you definitely want to come into committee with very specific and very creative ideas that other people won't have. If you look at your background guide, there is a proposed solutions or possible solutions section that you can go off of, but all delegates have read that, and they will all come into the committee proposing these ideas. So what you need to do is to do research to come up with very creative solutions so that when they're heard in the committee, I'm sure will be like, oh yeah, that's the solution from the delegate of Afghanistan, and I think it's very interesting and very unique. So that's just one way to make yourself stand out. Other ways are to create a framework for a working paper and draft resolution, and this means that it's a structure or a name for the draft resolution. So for example, you could come into the committee on the first or second day and say, all right, I propose a framework, or I propose that the topic be addressed using the method of peace, and then usually peace will stand for something, or you can just name your strategy and then talk about what it is, and then later on, if that strategy appears in the draft resolution, and if you continuously drill it in every single speech, So the chair will be like, all right, the delegate of Chile really wants peace is in the strategy. It's in the draft resolution. Other delegates are starting to talk about it, and therefore the delegate of Chile has really done a good job in making an impact and working with other delegates. Um, so that is a very, very, very important way to be very visible in the committee. Um, Two other things. First of all, being on at all times. The conference is very long. It's very, 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 very tiring. You have to always be talking, be writing something down, be reading, be researching. But to be honest, I think that it's very important to always be at your best. Know when to take a break. Know that at night you need a lot of good sleep to do well in the committee. But at the same time, if you see assistant directors walking around during unmonitored caucuses, if you're in a speech, even if you're in your chair, don't be asleep. Just make sure that you're at the very least looking active and looking attentive, and that you're not on your phone or just kind of nodding off or looking bored. Delegates, it's very, very important that you do this, because if the director sees you kind of slacking and not doing well, in that front, then they'll know that you don't have a good attitude about Model UN and you're not grateful for being there, and you might be out of the consideration for an award. And I know that that's very serious, but unfortunately, you only have so many times where the director can look at you and can see what you're doing. So if any of those times is that you're napping, unfortunately, that won't reflect well on you. We can usually tell the difference between you generally being tired and wanting a break, as opposed to being lazy and not being very involved in the committee. So that's just something very important to note. And lastly, in terms of being visible, one thing you can do is approach the dais. This is quite a controversial subject, in that some directors are more welcome to delegates approaching the dais, whereas others are not. So I'm going to just give you a couple rules of thumb as to how to do this. First, we have our committee emails. Mine is disec@hmn.org, hmanindia.org, I'm sorry. And you can look at your director's email on the website, and just make sure that you ask questions ahead of time. Make sure that they're substantive and they're not like, hi, director, what is Model UN or something like that. But we'll probably remember your question if it's a particularly good one moving into the conference. At the beginning of the conference, feel free to introduce yourself to your chair, and throughout the conference, if you have any questions that are actual questions and not just questions that are an excuse to approach the chair, feel free to ask them. It's just a way of getting your face out there and just reminding the director, hi, I'm the delegate of blank, I'm here. And it's a very subtle but very important way to get to know the director. At the same time, I've had many scenarios in which delegates approach me far too often, and they take away from my time with other delegates who have more important questions. Sometimes in the middle of debate, delegates will try to pull me aside, say it's very urgent, and just ask for a very insignificant question. So definitely be very, very respectful of your director's time, and just try to use common sense to find a balance in that sense. Some delegates like to ask for feedback from the director, and most directors are happy to do this, but usually only if you ask before. So for example, if you come in at the end of the conference, or not even, maybe at the end of the first session, and say, all right, how did I do? Usually at this point, the director doesn't know who everyone is. You might have only made one speech, and it's very difficult. Whereas if you ask ahead of time, then the director can specifically look out for you so that he or she can take specific notes and feedback to give to you later. So that's just a couple things to think about. All right, so that's it for visibility. I'm going to see if there's any questions really quickly. Visibility questions. Is it ISIS or ISIL? Frankly, it doesn't matter which one you use. Some countries use specific acronyms. So for example, the US officially uses ISIL. Other people use ISIS, IS, Daesh, and it just doesn't matter in debate. I think everyone knows what ISIS is. Okay, all right, and one other question is, I missed this webinar. Can I see it later? Yes, you can. It's being recorded, and they'll be posted later on. So don't worry if you're not taking notes or if you came in late. All right, so moving on for tips for success. The next thing is content. Now, content is something that's often overlooked in Model UN. Some people think if I speak the loudest and if I'm vaguely correct, I will get the gavel. Unfortunately, that is not the case, at least not at HMAN India. Our directors have spent a very, very, very long time researching their topic. They came up with it on their own. They had to write 40 pages about the topic, so as you know, they're probably experts on this topic. So we know what's creative, we know what's a good solution versus a bad solution, we know when you're being accurate versus inaccurate, and so you really need to take the time to do your own research. A couple tips about research. Definitely read the background guide, definitely go off of the background guide in terms of doing your research, but make sure you also have some unique sources so you're not simply parroting what other people say. A good idea might be to look at op-ed or opinion and editorial pieces online, not as factual sources because they aren't always credible, but as jumping off points for unique and creative ideas and solutions on the issue. So for example, there's a lot out there about ISIS. Some are extremely radical, but I would also say that they might provide you with very interesting insights into possibilities for solutions on the issue. Definitely, as I said before, come up with a framework if you want to get your ideas heard and if you want to be perceived as a leader of the block. But make sure that this framework isn't totally random and just like short term, current, and long term. That doesn't really mean anything. If it's genuinely good strategy or genuinely good organization tactic for your ideas and a draft resolution, it'll be much appreciated by the director and by all of the delegates in the committee. In terms of content, again, work at all time frames, scopes, and global regions. This simply means that all issues are very multifaceted, and you can't only focus on the facet that your country is involved in. So work with all time frames, past, present, future, short term, long term, etc. Make sure that you're addressing all regions of the world, even if, for example, the topic is only about the Middle East. If you talk about preventative measures in other regions, the director might be very appreciative of this, and this is easier to carry over to other topics as well. And all scopes, so whether it's local, global, regional, in terms of specific demographics, females and children, both genders, all economic prosperity levels. It really depends on your topic as to what scopes are relevant, but just keep in mind that there are many, many, many sides to every topic that are at HMAN India, that is at HMAN India. All right, and lastly, about content, don't plagiarize. Please don't plagiarize. There is an entire webinar about plagiarism, so I won't repeat this, but don't plagiarize. Once again, directors have read through all of the main sources on this topic, so they might be able to recognize if you've plagiarized. I've seen delegates copy and paste a background guide into their position papers or into speeches, and directors will know, and it's taken extremely seriously at HMAN India. So please, please don't plagiarize. So that's it for content. Moving on, my next tip is about policy representation. I think I've talked about this a lot, but just make sure that you're representing your country well. Don't be afraid to be cutting edge, and that means that if you create your own ideas, as long as they're in the same vein as what your country has been thinking before, I think that's fine. Sometimes you'll need to extrapolate, so generally taking the big ideas from a country's policy and moving them into other spheres is a very important skill that you need to learn. But just make sure that you are using common sense and that you're representing your country accurately and appropriately. All right. Are there any questions down here before I move on to the last couple? Yes, you can give an idea with its source. So if it's in the position paper, you can write a full citation and just use online guides to citations if you're curious. And in a speech, for example, if you're giving a quote or if you have a proposed solution from a specific author, you can say, according to Professor White, this idea is a good one and here's why. Let's see if there are any other questions. Yes, I talked about whether we can record debate. I'm not sure about this. If you send me an email, I can get back to you, or better yet, if you email info at hmanindia.org, it's a question that you can ask them. If you're new to Model UN and you have a lot of questions, make sure that you read the background guide and the delegate handbook first. And after that, if you have any questions, feel free to send emails to your committee director or the info account, and also ask your director or even other more experienced delegates at the conference. Okay, cool. Okay, so moving on to the last couple of tips that I have. The next one that I have is diplomacy. So I've talked about this quite a bit, and there will be another webinar on this about success in blocks and building blocks and in collaborating in blocks. But just in general, be diplomatic. So be respectful of other countries and their positions. Be respectful of other individuals. Make sure that you're not, demeaning everybody. Make sure that you're working together and pulling people in as opposed to pushing them away. Um, and I think that the best way to think about this, or the best measure of this, is to make sure that you're treating delegates that you might not like or might not agree with well. So we're not looking at how you handle, your friends. We're looking at how you handle delegates that you don't want to work with. So, for example, a good diplomat might say to a delegate that they don't want to work with, "Hi, delegate. Unfortunately, we have developed a very strong framework in our block and for our working paper, and we don't think that your ideas are compatible. Unfortunately, they're extremely conflicting with ours, but I think that that block over there might be more compatible with your ideas or more open to compromise. And maybe you can walk them over and say, like, hey, this delegate has an idea." Just making an effort to have everyone's voices heard, even if they might not mesh well with your working paper or draft resolution. A bad delegate, on the other hand, might say, like, "No, we don't want you here, get out. No, you have bad ideas, you're completely wrong. Look at this document that I found online. It says the opposite of what you said, and therefore you're wrong, and please don't be here." Um, I've seen a wide spectrum of bad behaviors, and I assure you that the dais will as well, so make sure that you're just being very, very respectful. Um, Another point about diplomacy: don't use them as tools. They're your team members. You never know what a delegate could be thinking. Everyone has very, very good ideas that they could contribute. Some delegates might be very quiet but could write killer clauses. Some might not have done their research but are extremely good speakers and could advocate well for your block. Others might be very good people, in terms of like interpersonal skills, and therefore they could pull delegates into your block or encourage them to vote for your draft resolution. Just keep in mind what skills they have and put them to use, but don't be like, all right, like you're just a body that can vote for my draft resolution. That's just not okay. Everyone is human. Another point about diplomacy: build a diverse block. I think it's very, very impressive when you can say, I've assembled this block that represents a lot of countries from different regions, different economic positions, and things like that, but we have come together and we have made compromise to create this draft resolution and these set of policies. But at the same time, make sure that you're not too diverse and that you're still on policy and working with people that you should be. And yep, I think that's it for diplomacy. Just make sure that you're kind of fulfilling your own expectations for yourself. Don't go by what the chair thinks is the best delegate necessarily, because unfortunately there only are so many awards that we can give out. So as long as you think you did your best by the end of the day, that's what's important. And if that happens to mean getting an award, that's fantastic. But awards aren't everything. Cool. Moving on to another set of tips. Understanding your chair. So I've talked about when it is appropriate to approach your chair and how you should do this, but it's another matter to really understand your chair. And I think that this is something that good delegates will do very uniquely, and there's maybe only a handful that can do this well. But if you can do it, it'll really, really help you be successful in the GA. So how do you go about it? First step, read your background guide. A lot of the background guide is simply a research report on the topic, but there are also some sections, whether it's an introduction or other parts, that might give away your chair's philosophy on how to run a committee. So, for example, I know that I wrote into my background guide that we will be focusing heavily on substance and collaboration and long-term strategies. So if you know that the chair likes those kinds of things and is looking out for those, they might look more favorably upon you. The other ways to do this are obviously writing your chair emails or asking them about this in person. Usually it's not really appreciated when you ask upright, how do I win the gavel? But maybe ask more subtle questions like, what do you think makes a good delegate or a good leader? What are you looking to see in speeches? Sometimes it's good to ask more indirect questions about substance so that you know what they're looking for, instead of asking like, all right, like what should I say? That is usually inappropriate and you're kind of being a bit too obvious there. Also note that there is a webinar on awards judgment that you can take a look at. Okay. The last section that I have that I think is very important and that I think is very, very kind of obscure and not thought about is troubleshooting. So, what do you do when something goes wrong? I can't tell you the amount of times that I've thought that I've been doing very well in committee, that I have a block assembled, that I made a couple good speeches, that my working paper is looking great, and suddenly something goes wrong. Whether it's another delegate decides to take over my block, whether I made a bad speech, another working paper is exactly the same as mine and they refuse to compromise, a merger goes wrong, you fall sick one day and have to miss a session. I've had delegates that missed an entire day, I think it was the first day, and they still got an award because they recovered so well. So troubleshooting is a very important skill. Weaker delegates might hit a roadblock or an obstacle and simply drop out of the race. But if you want to be successful in the GA, obviously that can happen. That cannot happen. So how do you do this? First of all, talk to your chair. I think that most chairs, if something is going wrong for you, are very, very eager to help and are very, very eager to encourage you and to give you tips as to how to recover. So just make sure that you're using them as a resource. Your assistant directors might also be able to help with that. Second thing that I think is very underrated, do research in your free time. You might have walked in with a set of research that you think is really good, but other people will bring up different points from what you have or have stances that you're not as familiar with, and it's very impressive. You can walk in the next day and respond to those. And it's very obvious when a delegate has only researched one part of the topic or only walks in with one solution and doesn't budge from those. So if you don't think that you have adequate research, or if you would really like to buff up your working paper and draft resolution, if other blocks are talking about things that you don't have, feel free to do research when committee is not in session. A third tip for troubleshooting is talk to others. I guarantee you that if something is going wrong for you, you are not alone. And there are just a couple categories of delegates that you might be able to find sitting around the room. Usually the first number one is people that are left out. Some people are left out because their ideas are too radical, others are too quiet, others are kind of maybe part of a block, but they just stand at the side of the room and don't really have a strong feeling about them. So it's very easy to spot these delegates. Simply sit down, try to be their friend, talk to them, ask about their ideas, ask about what they want to accomplish, and then ask them to work with you. Definitely, if you're feeling left out of the committee, it is an amazing experience to have someone be nice to you and talk to you, and everyone wants to feel wanted and part of a team. So if you can do that for people, usually you can do better in a committee, even when things are going wrong. If you yourself don't have a block, ask to join it. Usually people are very welcome to have other ideas, as long as you have a specific idea to offer and you're not just like, all right, let me look at your working paper, great, it's mine now. I think that people would be very welcome. Feel free to talk to a delegate in a block, ask what's going on, what is your working paper draft resolution all about, and then maybe have some suggestions. You probably have to be a bit more tactful about this one simply because you're not already a member of their block. And so you can't just walk in and say, I think that's great, but I think that's completely wrong and you should change it. Try to be a bit more constructive and collaborative so that people see you as a valuable potential addition to their team. A third thing you can do to recover that works very well is make really good speeches. So if you're lagging behind in the committee, if you're not really part of a block, if you make an incredible speech or two, people will remember you, people will want to work with you, the dais will remember it, and don't feel the need to be loud and radical and make kind of unnecessary jokes or strange metaphors. Food ones are very popular. Just make a good, substantive, articulate speech, and it can go a very, very long way. Another thing is be active. So if something's going wrong for you, don't just sit there and be like, ugh, I really hope that things get better for me because they're not going well so far. You really have to take an active role in making your situation better. There's no one looking out for you in the committee. It's every man for himself, unfortunately. So if you want to be successful, you have to create success for yourself. And the final tip that I have in general, this applies to troubleshooting, but also just the entire committee, take breaks and relax. Committees can get so stressful, and no one likes to work with a grumpy, competitive person. feel free to just step out during debate. Even if you're not going to grab your computer and work on a draft resolution, you are allowed to leave the committee room, but not for too long, and you don't have to ask the chair. Just go to the bathroom, splash water in your face, maybe grab a cup of coffee, even if you need to step outside and kind of lie down and shut your eyes for 2 seconds. Feel free to do that. It's a very taxing time. It's very taxing on your body. Make sure you hydrate, and just make sure that you're taking care of yourself first. So that's about it for all the tips that I have for success. And at this time, I'll be taking all of the questions that you have, no matter what they're about. So if you have any questions at all, feel free to ask them at this time. I'll be scrolling up. Okay. And if I miss your question, I'm going to be answering them in order, so just ask it again. Okay. Does the draft resolution have to be submitted on paper, or can it be submitted digitally? They are submitted digitally, so it has to be on a Microsoft Word document. Usually, you should bring a big tip, bring a USB or a thumb drive, so that if it's on your laptop, you can transfer it to the thumb drive and either give it to other delegates to merge, or when it's time to submit, you can give it to the chair, and they'll look at it, they'll format it, and then we will print it for you and pass it out to everybody in the committee when it's time to introduce the documents. Okay. Should sources be cited in the position paper? Absolutely, please do that. Are gadgets allowed in the committee? As I said before, no, unless it's an unmonitored caucus or it's between sessions, but you can bring them outside the committee during debate to work on it unless it's voting time. Draft resolutions are necessary. Press releases are not done in the General Assembly under HMUN procedure. To be considered a good delegate, will he or she have to be good at speaking, writing, and advocating? Frankly, yes. I think that because there are so many delegates, if you have a special field, that's fantastic, and you're definitely going to be a good team member. And you are obviously a good delegate if, for example, you're an amazing speaker or you're very good at writing draft resolutions. But if you really want to be the best, you probably have to do all of the above. It might seem impossible at times because you have to be in a million places at once and you only have like 5 minutes to do so, but just know where to spend your time and your effort, and make sure that you showcase all of the skills and all that you have to offer during the committee. How many press conferences are there in HMUN? This depends a lot. Usually it's just 1 or 2, if any. For those of you who don't know, a press conference is when a member of the press corps will walk in and answer or actually ask questions of specific delegates because they've been doing their research on their own time, and they'll be like, all right, delegate of the US, why did you say this? And they'll be held accountable for it. So it's a very exciting opportunity. But I can't guarantee that there will be press conferences. When there is an issue, wouldn't there only be 2 blocks for and against? Absolutely not. First of all, that would mean that there is 100 people in 1 block, which is obviously problematic. But I can't really think of an issue in which there is only a for and against position. So, for example, if the issue was abortion, yes, there might be for and against, but in issues like the future of state boundaries in the Middle East, can you be for or against the future of state boundaries in the Middle East? Not really. And the same goes for most other topics. So usually blocks will divide along more abstract lines, and it's hard for me to say what they are. The best place to see recommendations for potential block policies and kind of divisions are in the block position section of your background guide, and they should be there. But they're kind of amorphous. Often it's unclear as to how exactly each block is different from one another. They simply are 2 different sets of ideas that are competing to see which one is best and aren't necessarily ideologically against each other. It just really depends on the committee and what happens and what delegates show up. So I can't really say what blocks will look like right now. Since there is only 1 resolution passed, will there be some negotiations? Yeah, so definitely, just to clarify, you write working papers, as many working papers as you want can be submitted, and then after that, usually the chair will limit the amount of draft resolutions that can be introduced. So you have to negotiate and merge the working papers into a big draft resolution to make sure that as many ideas can be represented as possible, and to make sure that your draft resolution is as good as possible, so when it comes time to vote, yours will be the one passed. In terms of negotiations after their draft resolutions and right before voting, some might negotiate to have, for example, a mutual voting agreement. So if my block votes for your draft resolution, then your block has to vote for mine. You might individually come up to delegates and say, please vote for my draft resolution. The biggest form of negotiation is through procedure, in which you can motion to change the order of voting. So, for example, if the default is to vote for draft resolutions 1, 2, then 3, but you can motion to change it to be 3, 2, 1, 2, 1, 3, 3, 1, 2, whatever you'd like, because the rule is that the first one that is passed is the draft resolution and you don't vote on the rest. So usually people will want theirs first. Those are just some things to keep in mind. Okay. Does H1 India follow the same procedure as H1? Yes, it does. How do you form blocks and meet people who agree with you when there's so many delegates? Obviously, you can't meet every single person in the room. Just kind of do your best, start early, make sure that you're making friends right at the get-go, and just maybe look out for speeches. So if someone says something in a speech that you really agree with, you can write them a note and say, hey, I really like your speech, I'd love to work with you, can I have your number, or here's my number, or let's meet at the specific time, and just kind of asserting yourself that way to other people. All right, I like that you guys are answering each other's questions, it's really great. Let's see. Yeah, so Ash K9 said extending the for and against. For example, HGA, their topic is the Vietnamese invasion into Cambodia. So it's true, you can be for and against that, and that's the clear division, but there is also divisions within that, then blocks might form. So for example, this isn't the best example for like topic wise, but you can just think about it like in degrees. So yes, you might say, I want Vietnam to invade, I don't want Vietnam to invade, but within the for group, for example, there might be disagreements in terms of how they should invade, how many people should invade, how long they should invade for, should anyone else invade with them, things like that, that are more nuanced than for. And in the against camp, you might have, should there be repercussions if Vietnam chooses to invade? Should there be an alternative? And what should that be? So it's never as simple as for and against. I've answered this before. Does DISEC have a crisis? It will not, probably, and in the GA, the closest thing you have to crisis is crisis breaks, so it might be like a news update, like ISIS has bombed something. And the delegates can only respond to that in terms of modifying their working papers to draft resolutions. You can't do a press release, communique, or crisis notes. Is crisis only for specific committees? Yes, there are some specifically crisis committees, and those are the main crisis ones. The other committees could have crisis breaks, like I just mentioned, but as a general rule of thumb, they're only crisis committees. I'm at my last question, so if you have any last minute questions, please write them now. What should a working paper consist of? This is a really good question. So usually a working paper, what it's supposed to be in H1 protocol is a representation of the committee's thoughts on the topic. So that can take of any form, from pictures to graphs to sentences to clauses if you would like, and I would recommend that you write it in draft resolution format. But it can really be anything. It can be a collection of country stances on the topic, of historical events that have happened, of facts that you think are very important for the entire committee to know. But usually it's mostly solutions based. So usually it's like a preliminary form of a draft resolution. Because there are mergers, some people choose to write their working paper on a specific topic so that later they can go up to a draft resolution that's in the process of merging and say, all right, like we have the working paper that addresses the economic aspects of this issue, and I know you don't have any economic clauses in your draft resolution yet, and usually they'll be very open to merging. So working paper can really take any form. It just depends on what you have to offer and who you work with and what they would like to put in the working paper. Okay. What if you don't have any knowledge on the debate going on? So hopefully you've read the background guide, and that should give you plenty of knowledge. And most delegates will also do outside research on the topic as well. But if in the moment you don't know what's going on because maybe a delegate raised a very obscured fact, or you're talking about, maybe like a region that you're not so familiar with, don't be intimidated. Usually, if you don't know what's going on, it's not a central part of debate, so you're not too behind and you're not missing out on anything. But if it continues to stick as a very major point in debate, what I would advise you to do is either write a note to the chair and ask, "What is this?" and they will respond. You can ask other delegates around you that might be knowledgeable, or if you're able to, go outside the room, especially if it's the end of the session, and Google it and research it yourself. HGA progresses through years, so it is like a crisis. Okay, I will revise my previous statement to say that HGA will have crisis, unlike the other GAs, but it will be in the form of crisis breaks. So it's not full crisis in that everyone is playing a specific character and that you have portfolio powers and that you write crisis notes, but there will be more crisis breaks that you as delegates have to respond to in your working papers and draft resolutions. And if you want more details about that, you should ask Colin, our HGA director, on his email account. All right, so I see no other questions. If you have them, please write them now. And I just have a couple announcements for you before this webinar ends. So first of all of our information about the conference is on our website, h1india.org. You can email your director, so it should be committee name at h1india.org. Did I say HN1? It's h1india.org. With substantive questions, so questions about things in the background guide, questions about the topic, etc. And you can ask the info account, which is info@h1india.org, with logistical or administrative questions. And if you're not sure which to email, just email your director, and if it's something that the info account should answer, they'll just forward you there. Secondly, make sure to read the background guide. Please, please, please do this. If you don't read the background guide, you're not going to know what's going on in committee, so that's very important. Your password to the background guide, which you need to access them, is given to your delegation when you register. And just ask your faculty advisor or your head delegate if you don't have it already. And if you're not sure about it, once again, you can email info@h1india.org. Position papers, very important, are due Monday, July 25th, uploaded to Monbase. If you email it to your director, we can't accept it, so you have to upload it to Monbase, and if you're not sure how to do that, ask your faculty advisor or your head delegate. And lastly, this year, for H1 India, we do have an impact initiative because we have so many wonderful delegates coming in. It would be a shame not to do some sort of social impact aspect that can impact the real world and not just kind of hypothetical simulation scenarios that we're doing in committee. So this year, the Impact Initiative will be themed around the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals that were recently created as a follow-up to the Millennium Development Goals. And so what you should do is you should submit a 3 to 4 minute video of an organization near you that works towards achieving one or more of the SDGs, and you can find more about that on the UN website. And all the videos will be shared by H1 India, but if yours is one of the best, we'll have a selection panel and it will be chosen on Facebook. So the top 5 that get the most votes will be screened at the conference, and then the winner will get an H1 India Impact Heroes Award. So this is a really cool opportunity to show off some of the good work that people in your community are doing, and more information about this is on the website. Okay. I have a couple more questions, so I will answer these, and then I think it's time to end the webinar. What if, Shanak1, could you please elaborate on your question? What if asked to speak, can you talk to your mates? Will we get breaks in between the session? So in between sessions, you obviously have breaks. Usually it's a lunch break or you're breaking for the day. But within each session, you will get unmoderated caucuses. And these aren't only for collaboration and writing. You can also just go get a drink of water, go to the bathroom, etc. And you can also take your own break anytime in the committee if it's a moderated caucus, or basically if you're not voting. Are you allowed to discuss with delegates close to us during the sessions? This is a really important question. You're not supposed to talk to other delegates when debate is going on because it's simply disrespectful and rude. What I would say you should do is write notes and you can simply pass it to them. I know it's less efficient than whispering and leaning over, but it's very, very distracting and very, very rude to the speaker. Just make sure that you pass notes instead of talking to each other. Are you allowed to walk to the committee whenever? Kind of. You can walk out mostly during moderated caucuses. You can simply leave the committee. Make sure that you step out in between speakers so you don't just get up and leave when someone's speaking. That's very disrespectful. But you can take your laptop with you, your phone with you. You can access those and write your draft resolutions and working papers, or you can just take a quick bathroom break. You do not need to ask your director for a point of personal privilege, and you do not need to ask them on a note if you want to leave the room. We trust that you're doing either like taking a bathroom break or doing committee related things, but there will be staffers outside the room making sure that you're not just on Facebook on your laptop outside the committee room. So to correct this comment made by anonymous 7831363321, points of personal privilege are not for allowing delegates break. You don't have to ask those. They're only for things like, can we make this room hotter or colder? That's like the main reason for points of personal privilege. The other thing is for points of personal privilege if someone is speaking too softly and you can't hear them, or maybe even too loudly and it's really hurting your ears, you can interrupt them and say, point of personal privilege, audibility, and they'll adjust accordingly so that you can hear them properly. What makes a good position paper? I think this is a really good question. Usually it includes a couple things. So first of all, your country's history with the topic, so how have they been involved? Secondly, your stance on the topic, so what your country's beliefs are. And thirdly, a couple solutions that you propose heading into the committee. So I might even recommend that in the solutions you put your framework, as I talked about before, so that when the director reads your position paper, they'll be like, wow, it's really well researched. They came up with this idea well in advance and they successfully implemented it into a draft resolution at the end of the conference. Okay, what if I have some time remaining after my opening speech and want to yield to another delegate, but I don't know who to yield to? Generally, at HMIN India, we don't really have yields. You are only allowed to, okay, so I think that the protocol is that you're only allowed to yield if it's a speaker's list speech. If it's a moderated caucus speech, you cannot yield. But even then, I don't think that directors will allow yields. It's up to their discretion. So definitely ask them ahead of time, or maybe ask a point of parliamentary inquiry at the beginning of the conference so that everybody's clear on what your director wants in terms of yields. Okay, if you're in the middle of a speech and don't have complete knowledge, can you ask your friends? If you are giving a speech, you're the only one that can talk, so it's inappropriate to ask questions of other people in the middle of a speech, if that makes sense. How many awards are there? We have, it depends on the size of your committee, so I won't say now. This can be confirmed with the info account or with your director at the conference, but it shouldn't really matter, if that makes sense, because awards aren't everything. Are we allowed to use the internet? I'm not entirely sure if internet will be available to all delegates at the conference hotel, so you should confirm with info@hminindia.org. But if there is internet, you can only use it outside of the committee room or during unmoderated caucuses. When I'm using background guide information in the position paper, do I cite it? I would say yes, you should cite it. And then could you please go over the framework again? So this will be recorded, so you can go back and see what I say about the framework, but just for your convenience again, it's an idea for how a draft resolution should be structured. So for example, it could be like economic solutions, social solutions, political solutions, military solutions. You could come up with a fancy acronym or name for it, and that's your idea for the framework. Obviously, this shouldn't be the only thing that you bring into the committee. You should have more specific ideas as to what should go under that framework. But if you have a framework and you successfully implement it into the draft resolution and it's clearly yours, it'll make it clear that you are kind of the leader of that block. Okay, if there's no history of our country on the topic, so Once again, you can't do research in the middle of debate unless you leave the room or between sessions at night, which I highly advise. But the best thing you can possibly do is be very, very well prepared ahead of time. And if you really can't find anything, whether it's about your country's stance or your allies' stance or regional organizations that you're a member of, like the African Union or the Organization of American States, for example, you can ask your director for some tips as to how to find your country's stance and what it is. Can you yield to the chair? Yeah, so technically at the end of every speech, you yield to the chair. Some directors will make you say, I yield to the chair, others will not. It just depends on your director. What if you doze off and it's your turn to speak? Hopefully, the people sitting next to you knows what country you are and will wake you up. And we probably, depending on the hotel, but we probably will have the list of countries about to speak on the projector, so you will be able to see when you speak. But my best advice for you would be not to doze off at all, because that's very disrespectful and will not bode well for you in terms of success in the GA. Last time the sleeping delegate was asked to leave the session for a day. It could happen depending on your director. Okay, what is the point of parliamentary inquiry? A point of parliamentary inquiry is when you have a question about protocol or procedure or the schedule. So, for example, when this will usually happen when the chair is taking motions, so not in the middle of speeches, for example, but if the chair asks for points or motions, you can say point of parliamentary inquiry. They'll call on you and you can ask questions like, what is a point of order? Are you taking notes at this time? How many sponsors are needed for the draft resolution? What is going to happen for the rest of the day? What does the schedule look like? Are there limits on the amount of sponsors? Just things like that that you want to ask the chair. You can also ask them in note form, but if you feel that it pertains to the entire committee, then feel free to ask a point of parliamentary inquiry. Okay. So I think that's it for questions. Once again, this will be posted online after this webinar is over, which will be in a couple seconds. Thank you so much for listening, and best of luck in the General Assembly, and I can't wait to meet all of you at HMIN India 2016.